Greetings to anyone present here. I'm Dr. L. Santosh Kumar, Assistant Professor of English at Presidency College Autonomous, Bengaluru, Karnataka, India. Today, I'm here to enlighten each and every one of you on the topic gender and testimony. Let me share my screen first. And in the contemporary times, people often try to talk about the element called gender sensitization, or in other words, they also call it as gender equity or gender equality. And most importantly, the idea of gender is being redefined and it's also being revisited by scholars, by so many scholars. And also at the same time, they try to ensure that gender studies tries to blur the line between personal and political. And most importantly, by having gender studies as an impetus, it is quite evident to say that literature is always apolitical. And most importantly, by meaning the term apolitical, literature tries to traverse the margins. And most importantly, when it traverses all those margins, all the skeptic mentalities are being made known to the world. And most importantly, today in the contemporary times, the element gender or the term gender studies as is becoming an interdisciplinary phenomenon. And also at the same time, it tends to root with so many multidisciplinarities. And by default, what happens is that gender studies starts to question the authenticity or aura of a particular problem. And having this as an impetus, today let us get into this particular term called testimonio and how gender studies and testimonio merge together. And the moment when they merge together, they try to come out with beautiful and scholarly literary works which are not only aesthetic but which also makes the readers to understand how literature and history merge together. And let us get into the term testimonial. What do we mean by testimonial? And there's one important branch of literature called testimonial literature. And testimonial literature is derived from the word testimonio. Now, in the contemporary times, people they never use this particular term called testimonial literature, whereas they use only testimonio. So, in order to understand, in order to know about its exact roots, so only I emphasize this particular term, testimonial literature. Testimonio means witness narrative. And this particular theoretical discourse, it started from the Latin America, where the women in the Latin America, they protested against all sort of patriarchal norms of the government. And initially, there was a belief that testimonio is a part of feminist movement. Later, feminists all over the world who also represents different schools, they firmly emphasize the fact by saying that testimonio is a kind of movement which is for all genders, and most importantly it also talks about all sort of socio-political problems, whereas feminism they talk about different branches, different waves and different socio-political issues, but testimonio has got an edge in questioning the authenticity of history. And now, in the contemporary times, we always often ask a question, how authentic is authenticity? When that is being debated or when that is being questioned to a greater extent, we all of us should understand how the ideologies or how the terminologies are going to be terminated or how they are going to be redefined and reinterpreted. And when you look at this particular PowerPoint slide, you could see the first point, a first person narrative recounting experiences of oppression, or it can also be a form of political resistance through storytelling. And when you look at these 2 points, or when you deconstruct, or when you reanalyze, or when you reinterpret, or when you reread these 2 points, it's quite easy for each and every one of us to understand whether testimonial goes hand in hand with autobiography and memoirs. And here only we are supposed to make the difference with context to gender studies. For example, the famous work which shook the entire world, in terms of writing with the famous anecdote is that one book and one pen can change the entire world. This famous anecdote was uttered by Malala. Malala's particular work can be categorized or can be, sorry, can be labeled under the term memoir. And when it comes to autobiography, we all of us should understand one important aspect here is that autobiography is written by an individual, and most importantly, the individualism, the element of individual history or the element of individual importance is being glorified in autobiography. When it comes to testimonio, it is not about the individual. Even though it is individual, it is through individual the collective suffering or the collective truth is being brought to the limelight. And also at the same time, we all of us understand one important aspect is that autobiography and memoir, they talk about history, but they never question history. It's only testimonio which questions history to a different set of ruptures. And also at the same time, they tend to emphasize or they tend to highlight how different muted voices or how different muted representations they talk about different voices which were being unheard for so many years. And also at the same time, we should also understand how testimonials they question history. The simple way to question history is to reread the historiographies. Historiographies are said to be the process which are involved in creating a history. And next, most importantly, why do historiography plays a vital role in the context of testimonial and gender studies is that most of the traditions or most of the problems which gender of irrespective of all issues they undergo is that it is all a set of construct, and all those constructs they try to identify or they try to blur the lines. So in order to understand the blurring of the lines, it's quite easy for all of us to understand how does these testimonial texts or how do the writers or how do their voices are being manipulated by the power structures which acts at different levels owing to political monopolization. And when we talk about the idea of gender, or what do you mean by a gender in general, is that in the contemporary times, that in the present century, each and every one of us have a different stand or different viewpoint on the idea of gender. Whereas now we all talk about how these constructions or how these identities are being labeled or how they are being shaped upon. And most importantly, gender as an umbrella term, it doesn't restrict only to two different layers in the contemporary times. It is being multiplied, and also at the same time, the more it diversified, it also gets manipulated. The reason why it gets manipulated is that culture is also one of the taboo which acts as an hindrance in terms of representing one's own voices and one's own experiences. And next most important thing is that when we discuss about the element of testimonial, as you mentioned in the very first slide, it describes witness narrative. And what do we learn or what do we color from the idea of witness narrative is that we all should understand one important aspect is that there are famous seminal texts which talks about gendered perspective in terms of testimony. And one such famous work is that I Regobeta Menchu. And this particular work is written by a famous seminals and a famous testimonialista. The writers of Testimonio are said to be testimonialistas. And this particular person, she talks about the suffering of Indian women exclusively, suffering of Indian women exclusively at Gautimela. So, and most importantly, there are other testimonials like which talks about cure studies, which also talks about the plight of transgenders. Transgenders in the contemporary times, they suffer in terms of a space. And the idea of home or the concept of home is being problematized and politicized in the context of minor discourses. And all these minor discourses, they are becoming the powerful discourses in the contemporary times, and testimonial, which pars with gender studies, cults out all these unheard voices. And the beauty of testimonial, and the beauty of testimonial is that it tends to make the people to understand how ignorant they were, and also how falsified truths were being glorified, and also at the same time how it tries to bridge the gap between personal and political. When all these ideas, or when all these scepters are being reinterpreted, or it is being redefined, then we do not know what sort of political representations or what sort of historical misrepresentations, and most importantly, even we are supposed to reanalyze or reinterpret this particular term, that is representations or representations. So all these ideologies or all these ideological constructs are being debated to a greater extent. And also at the same time, one important thing we all should understand here is that the concept of history is being uh, debunked, and also at the same time, history right from the good old past, had often spoken about the importance of an individual. Whereas you often spoken about the collective rights. So, testimonials in the context of gender studies, it talks about the voices of different unheard truths, and how these unheard truths were being falsified by the power structures in order to gain momentum. And also at the same time, testimonial through gender studies, it makes us to know how different representations, instead of saying representations, how different representations of women are being made known to the limelight. So, on the whole, I would just like to conclude by saying that testimonial, it not only constructs the originalities, but it also tends to make people to understand how different representations and how different ideologies can blur the line between personal and political. And when all those lines are being blurred, and when they are being brought to the center, by default, the falsified truths will not be in the limelight, and the original truths will be glorified. And these are some of the standard text which are exclusive for gender and testimonial. And to talk about this particular uh, work, Testimonial Politics of Truth, it was John Beverly who said that the best way to learn subaltern is through testimonials. There's a famous person called John Gugelberger who said that a testimonialist can explain his or her own personal testimony directly or indirectly by addressing a specific interlocutor. And these are all some of the elements or viewpoints on testimonial with part two gender studies. Thank you so much.